welcome everybody to this conversation that we are having with Zara Chowdhary, who's a writer, who's a professor, and has a lot of other labels going for her. But most of all, right now, the most important label is that she's the author of The Lucky Ones, which is a book that everybody in India has to read. And if you haven't read it yet, what are you doing? I mean, this is like a serious question because this is, I mean, it's called a memoir, but I feel like it is part memoir, part journalistic writing, part fiction, part non-fiction. It's like a mix of different forms of writing, and I think it's absolutely important that all of you read it. There's a review of the book in this month's edition of Frontline, so you can also read that review, and then pick up the book and read it. With that introduction to Zara, I want to contextualize this conversation with Zara. We will be speaking about her book, but but this conversation is also in memory of late Mrs. Zakia Jafri, who passed away recently. So, in that context, we are going to be talking to Zara. Zara, thank you for speaking to us. Thank you for coming on. And I mean, this conversation is going to be difficult, just like how your book is has been a really, really difficult book for me to read. But it also has been, I think, one of the most powerful, or maybe the most powerful memoir I've read. So thank you for speaking to us. And to begin with, uh, in one of your pages, you write that my childhood was a program in progress. That is one of the lines that you write in the context of your childhood. There's so many references to how you navigated that phase. But this line stood out for me because while you define that for yourself, you have also treated this whole process of writing this memoir with so much empathy. There's so much empathy dripping from your book. Even in the context of speaking about perpetrators, you have tried to speak with empathy, like, when you're referring to this one particular tribe, and why is it that they have been pushed, or what has institutionally dented them to become the people that they are. You have pushed yourself down that path of empathy, which is a very difficult process, right? Like, if I were to refer to an incident, like when I was working in Gujarat after the violence in Una, I was in this meeting in Gomtipura where there were Muslims and there were people who were from a particular village from the scheduled caste community. And both of them were reconciling with this important event that has happened between them, that some of them were perpetrators in what happened with Muslims, right? And I saw that they were trying to bring this process of empathy that I find in your book. So I just want to understand and begin this conversation with that. Why was that process so important for you? Not just while talking about the violence, while talking about perpetrators, but also while talking about what went on within your own family.
Thank you, Greeshma, and thank you so much for this conversation, for this invitation. You know that I've wanted to be in conversation with you for so long because I think you bring that empathy, that real looking at people as people and not just as the thing that happens to them, right? And um, I think that's key to anything we're doing, whether it is journalism, whether it is memoir, whether it is fiction, or painting. What are we doing if we're not first seeing the human in somebody or something, and then painting a context around it, and then situating it within a world? For me, I think the hardest thing of placing myself in the middle of the story was to remember that I am also a product of this place. That, as you grow up, especially when we're women and we've struggled anyway to define ourselves for so much of our early lives, I think in adulthood, it becomes very easy to get attached to an idea of this is just who I am and this is just how I am. And something about memoir, it makes you actually unpeel those layers that are so stuck to you. And you start to see that this was a world that constructed you. And so to me, it just becomes an extension. If I'm able to do that for myself, why and what stops me from doing that for others? And so I don't even know if empathy is the word for it, but for me, it becomes an exercise in being human. That if I'm able to understand myself through these complex lenses, and we live in a time and a world where everybody's constantly using therapy, mental health language to explain themselves to the world, or to pathologize someone else and say, oh, this is what's wrong with them, and that person's a narcissist, and that person is problematic for this reason. But we're not necessarily seeing that these layers of our environment, of the violence we go through. And violence is not just a pogrom. When I say a pogrom in progress, I'm talking about that trickling slow violence that surrounds all of us in all our communities, wherever we live, whether it is in India, whether it is abroad. There's constant slow violence being meted out on our bodies, on our selfhood, on our humanity. And for me, that exercise is why I wanted to write the book, to put myself in there. Because what else is, I mean, why else do we write or we make art or we do these things, right? If we're not wanting to live in the misery of that exercise, and you're pushing yourself to be someone more than you're allowed to be. For me, that's what the writing of the book was.
Right. So I'm going to read out this one portion, the epilogue, right? You write at the end that our idea of India and being Indian Muslims, as we learned it through Dada, Papa, Pupu, Amma, through blood, land and spirit ancestors, through teachers who taught us, and strangers who saved us, gave us a code to live by, the pursuit of justice at all costs. My home is this memory I hold of India, of who we once were. And my uprising is to keep the story writ into history no matter how much erasure stamps over it. So this para, in the context of the life of not just your life, but also the life of Mrs. Zakia Jafri, it brings us to this question, right? When your life has been about facing that denial of justice, that institutional justice that every individual in this country is supposed to be, is, I mean, that justice is something that you are owed, right?
Yes.
And, but truth is that that justice has been denied to you.
Mm.
So then how does a persecuted group then find justice? In what do you find justice? Because
Yeah.
and that's why I read this thing, because you said your uprising is to write this story and to, kind of leave this as your testament to your life and to your uprising. And that
Mm-hmm.
for me feels like it's connected with this question. But I want to ask that to you as well, and not only in the context of the life of Mrs. Zakia Jafri, but also in your own life journey.
I mean, I'll start first by talking about her. I think uh, Zakia ma'am, for me, and I've only known her from a distance. Towards the end of her life, when she spent a lot of time in the US, I used to think about this from time to time, that I am in the US at the same time that she is here, and especially every Feb 27th, 28th, it used to really sit with me, this feeling that how must she feel today? What must be going through her mind? And so when you talk about justice, the thing is that for us as Muslims, this idea of haq, of justice, that, what is owed to you, there's a very direct connection that we feel with the idea of Allah, and the idea that Allah will give you that justice. And you see it in so many figures in the world, even if they're not Muslim and like different faiths. But when Martin Luther King talks about the arc of the moral universe and it bending towards justice, there is a bigger theological, philosophical grounding that some people just have like spent their lives, and especially when you're persecuted, that you reach for that bigger universal sense of justice, because sometimes that humans are too small and they're too petty to be able to give something as grand as justice, to be able to offer you something as big as justice, right? And so for me, and it's why we have these terms, right? The Supreme Court. What does it mean, the Supreme Court? It's supposed to be the ultimate. place that you go to for justice. But for us, again, as Muslims, we do believe that it is Allah ka darbar. That is the hall where that ultimate justice happens, even if it doesn't happen on earth and in these nation states, the way that they are constructed and the way that they have been co-opted today. So for me, what she did by just going at every door and knocking and knocking and knocking repeatedly for these last 20, 23 years was landmark. And it was just a testimony to her intense and immense faith. Because if she knew that Allah is going to give me this justice, then it actually takes the burden off of you, right? Then you are not turning to this human figure and these human benches to really give you something. So then all you're doing is your human duty on earth. That you show up, you knock on the door, you do it as long as there is breath in your body. And for me, that it's that legacy. It's legacy of people like Mrs. Jafri that feels like my legacy. It feels to me like those are my elders, that I have to look at them and remember that that's what life is. As much as it is joy and hope and all of these things, it is also the fact that you keep knocking on that door. Whether the door opens or not is on them, but we have to keep knocking on the door. So that is the spirit, because it is crushing to even to spend 7 years on a book like this is crushing, especially at a time when nothing is getting better back home, right? I'm sitting in the US, I'm writing it, and then every 10 minutes something is showing up on social media. Every day some new trauma is showing up in the news. There were so many days where I would just crumble on the ground and I would curl up into a ball and I would weep and I would just not want to do this. So it was as if something had to drag me back to the desk and make me want to write the next chapter and the next. And I think that was not coming from inside. That was coming from looking outside at these figures of incredible inspiration for me. So for me, her life was so much more as well, right? Like she was a mother, she was a grandmother, she was a member of her community. She carried so many others with her in her call for justice. And so she was not doing this for herself. And it really reminds me, my friend Zahra Mehdi, who's a psychologist and an incredible speaker. She speaks a lot about the Shia tradition of demanding justice, which is a very strong tradition in India's fabric. We don't think about it, but it's underlying so much of what we believe of Indian Muslims. And she tells this beautiful story also about Zainab, who was Hazrat Ali's daughter, and Ali is the son-in-law of our Prophet Muhammad. So when all of these, the family of the Prophet are all murdered and slaughtered in this battleground, it is the woman, it is Zainab who is left, who's a survivor. Uh, and she goes up to the king, the tyrant who has done this to her family. And she asks for justice, not as this was my personal loss and that this was my family that you slaughtered, but she says this is the loss of my community. And it is that difference, right? And that sense of what are you carrying when you are a human, and when you especially come from these marginalized, minoritized communities, you are never just carrying your own load. You are always carrying your whole community with you. And I see this, I mean, in Dalit liberation so much, this sense that you're always carrying your whole community with you. And so for me, the fact that of all the cases, there were hundreds of cases, right, that have come out of Gujarat, people saying this mob in the village did this, those people who are our neighbors burnt this, those people did this to our daughters. But she was the only person who was carrying everybody with her and saying that I am going to at least write this down in the legal history of this country, that this was done to my whole qawm, to my community, and not just to my husband and to us. There's something there in that distinction when a human being is able to make, that you're an organism that's part of something bigger. And I think that became the drive even for me writing, that I'm not doing it alone, and neither am I walking this path alone. And I'm being carried by all these people, even the dead. And at the same time, I will never have to face this alone. Whatever comes will come for all of us. So I'd rather be with everybody.
You know, when we actually think about what she did, right? Like you described, like taking on some of the most powerful people in this
Yeah.
country, from the present prime minister to some of the biggest leaders
Mm,
from that state who've gone on to become like celebrated men, and comparing that to what you've done of writing this like a testimony, it's a memoir of everything. I understand when you say that the depth in this work comes from the fact that you're carrying this this uh this would like you're carrying your community forward when you're doing this work. But that load that you're describing is a considerable load as well, isn't it? There is personal, uh I don't know what to call it. There is a personal, like churning and reckoning that would be going on within you when you're going through this journey. And I feel like that's not discussed as much as it should be, because you are one person at the end of the day. And for you to write something like this, to document something like this over the years, from the time that you were a child, and for you to like become an adult, and in that
mm,
process of becoming an adult, for you to make your adulthood about documenting this is quite something. Speak, I mean, I want to know a little bit about your personal journey in coming to the point where writing this book, and also like what are the kind of personal challenges that you faced, because I feel like there would be a parallel that we could draw there, even with the reality of how difficult the journey was for Mrs. Jaffrey.
mm, mm. Thank you for that. I mean, it's very kind, all of the things you're saying, but I'm always uncomfortable with the feeling that I've done something big here because not literally. But Grishma, nothing in this book that, especially if I've written about the violence, not one thing is like a first person piece of data, like a primary source. Everything has been written over and over and over and over again. I can, for any news item that I have chosen and placed in here, I can give you 5 news sources that have spoken about it, have interviewed those people. So to me, in fact, at times I used to feel like a grifter. I used to be like, why is there so much? There is an abundance of information, and yet there is no sort of processing that us as a our community or our country have done. There's no reckoning that we have done despite the abundance of information, right? So my job actually really became of like like how a carpet weaver sits and weaves things. That was my job. And I kept reminding myself after a point. So I didn't have any grandiose ideas of, oh, I'm this and I'm doing that, and it's a burden and whatever. I only thought these are all threads that exist. Somebody has to just knot them together and make this pattern so it becomes more evident and more clear. The scale at which a pogrom affects an entire nation, not just one community, right? But for me, really, the drive personally is that, when you read the book, you recognize that I come from an extremely sort of violent home. There is no other way to describe it, whether it is emotional violence, it is physical violence, this sense of patriarchy. There's so much going on. But we also live in a world right now, and we've lived in this world for very long, almost as long as I have existed. I've been aware of it, where to speak my truth and to speak about my family would reflect poorly on my community, would immediately add to the narrative about men from my community. It would, in some way, be ammunition to further criminalize the men in my community. So for me, it became very clear that as much as that was the thing that was stuck in my throat, it was the story I wanted to tell was the story of my family. There was no way I didn't have the liberty or the privilege to write only about my family in this sort of like, very beautifully like spatial way of just this middle class Muslim family living in a building and their daily lives. we've seen enough novels and fiction that do that, where you can really zoom in and just spend time with like a few people in a way that is a very Western novelistic tradition, or even a memoir tradition.
But that is pretty much what my question is, that writing this is not just writing about the violence for you. You have brought in that element knowing these things, which is why I think the journey must have been super difficult. Even if you say that, that there are these sources, there is that this talk, but for you to center that and to bring in your story and kind of weave it together in the way that you've done must have been super difficult.
To me, it really felt at most times, Grishma, that so much has gone into making me who I am. And I know I don't even say only all the things that have happened. So many people have collectively, individually contributed to just my writing in my whole journey. When I would sit with this, and I had on the one side my family story, and I had on the other side the story of this violence and of this country, I had to keep reminding myself that I've had 15, 20 years of actual training in craft that people have funded, have given grants, have helped push me forward, have just, like just given me that thumbs up and said, keep going, keep trying. What else can I put that in service of, if not bringing craft and bringing technique to this in a way that it becomes undeniable? Because the thing is, our stories are also very easily denied and dismissed if they're lacking in craft. And for me, that became the very big challenge in this. So even when I was already 30 when I came for my second master's to the US. And people were laughing at me and saying, why aren't you, going to do something that can find you a job in America? Why are you going for a writing program? But for me, it was like, no, I need to be so particular and I need to know how to do this well enough that it is undeniable what I write. And it is certainly not dismissible. And for me, that became a bigger part of the journey, always feeling that pressure of not failing them as a writer. That when I'm telling the story of my father, when I'm telling the story of Ehsan Saab, when I'm telling the story of, Sunil, like every single person, when I'm telling, Bilkis Banu's story, her daughter's story, I have to remember that first, my job as a writer is to hold them with technique and to hold them in a way that gives back the life that has been stolen from them, and that reconstituting, right, of somebody's spirit, to bring them back and make them real for a reader. That is my only job. So I think being able to focus on like, what is my job in this was the question that I kept asking myself. Because it's very easy. Yes, you're very right in saying that it is hard. Like, it's very easy to crumble when it gets hard. But that's when I had to remind myself that this is the thing I have been trained for, and I have worked towards for so long to train myself.
And I think that technique comes through in so many places, because when you talk about technique, and then when I think about applying technique to talk memory, what comes to my mind is the story that you told about Wali Gujarati and what happens to his resting place, tomb, and then how
Right.
you speak about the covers of the people who died in the violence and what happened to that.
Yes.
When that technique comes through, if you were to actually sit and think about it, of how you narrated these two stories and how you connected the memory of your grandfather, of your dada with this, and then of yourself with this, of
Right.
your family, and then eventually what is to happen to that. I mean, thank God for technique that you kind of nurtured in yourself, that, we are able to read this and kind of take it in the way that I could when I was reading this book. But the reason why I bring this up is this is also a test of memory, right? Of the
Yes.
fact that you mentioned that there are people who are walking on that road looking for that, for that marker, not finding it, and then just leaving petals. And then
Right.
how people reconcile with this other living proof of something that's happened, but that hasn't been afforded, like the dignity that it should be. And
Yes.
that brings us to this question of how is it that, how do we, in a country that's denying and erasing and sort of doing away with speaking about memory, do we treat it with the dignity that it deserves?
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, that whole section actually, there was a piece that I really fought for to keep in the book with my editor even. I don't know if you remember it, but it's a place where I list all the steps for a Muslim burial.
Yeah.
And in that is where I mentioned the unmarked graves of the massacre victims and of the marked graves of my family and so on, right? And there was a lot of back and forth between the editor and me of like, this is a kind of piece that is not saying anything other than the fact that it's showing you all the ways in which you are supposed to approach a burial. The thing is, we're a very ritualistic country, right? In India, every single microculture has their rituals and their ways, and we're all very fixed in how things have to happen. One of the most traumatic things, though, is the ritual of death in our country, especially in the ways that either there is so much of like overt grieving that it actually robs the quietness that you need to be able to grieve, or then there is so much suppression that you are not allowed to fully feel the very loss, right? And so Islamic rituals, or to some degree, as a child, I always felt were the suppressing kind, where we were told, after 3 days, you can't cry anymore, and that it hurts the spirit and the memory of the people who are gone. And so I really believed this as a child growing up, that no, after 3 days, it is very wrong of me to cry. But what is that doing? It is taking away the right to process grief from you, right? And for me, whether it was my grandfather's death, my father's death, and then all of this mass death that suddenly came with 2002, it's been lying in the body and it's not been able to process. So for me, writing those sections became a way of saying, okay, now that I have the silence and the solitude to write, I would like to first grieve. And I'd like to grieve in a very public way, but with the quietness of the written word. Which is why you go through the ritual of every single piece of like, this is how you wash the body. This is how the body must lie facing Makkah. This is how you shroud it. But when you think of those who were not afforded those steps, whether it is, the ones who were dead for centuries, like Wali Gujarati, who were just uprooted and road made over them. And this is the story of most Indian dargahs right now. They're being razed and bulldozed as we speak. So you are not only taking away and stealing the dignity of those who have just passed and who have violently passed, you are also uprooting the resting place of the dead. Right. And there is something to be said about an impulse that pushes you to do that. I question that impulse in people. What makes you pull somebody from their resting place and do this? And we're seeing this in Gaza right now, right? The running bulldozers and rollers over cemeteries of people. What is that idea? And this is the history in the US. There's people that, I mean, half of the Halloween movies here are about this, that they're
Even
houses of
in even in
built over
Manipur,
burial grounds.
for me to see like graves pulled out and burnt was
Yeah.
actually like something that was
And so
you
that
just
it's
don't understand. Yeah.
and that is the kind of shock that you carry when you see that as a young person, of what is making human beings undignified, because they are indignifying themselves in doing it. They think they are showing you disrespect and demeaning you and diminishing you, but they are doing it to themselves at the same time. And that is something that I'm a little bit morbidly fascinated with, with what is making people do that. How far do you have to go in your hate? And how consumed do you have to be with this need to diminish and break the other, that it makes this out of you? Like, are you even human after that? That's for me the, sort of burning question.
That brings me to like, I mean, it instantly like, brings my memory to some of the characters that you've referred to in your book. One of them is Preeti ma'am that you fondly remember. But the other person is also your friend who calls you after a while and asks you, let's go for a movie, right? and she
In the
just like
middle of curfew.
in the
Yeah.
middle of a curfew. And
Yeah.
that kind of brings us to the question of people. I mean, again, how you juxtapose characters.
Mm.
People who are non-Muslims, but you've
Yeah.
tried to like show different characters. And that brings us to this question where there are people who are out there who are violent, who are clearly, doing what they want to publicly, and they continue to do that for like decades from 2002 to now. But then
Mm.
there are also people like your friend who are not ignorant, but who
Mm.
want to pretend like, I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
something that is, I feel like, very crucial that you've written in your book,
Mm.
because in your writing, of course, you're kind of suggesting where it is that that memory leaves you, what it is that you think of this person, but you're also like egging on people to kind of think about that attitude, right?
Mm.
Like
Mm.
either being silent or
Yeah.
either like being indifferent.
Yeah.
What does that kind of, okay, I mean, in placing that character, what is it that, you know, you were feeling when you were writing about that character?
I mean, that it's not characters, they're real people. But in
Yeah.
saying that and writing that story, I feel like over these last 20 years, that story has taken up more weight than it was. At the time, I think it was a very personal hurt, right? Somebody that you've gone to school with every day, who knows what you go through in your house. Even before there was a riot, they knew about the things that happen in your house and the kind of, troubled teenage mind you have. So they have, like, teenage friendships are so vulnerable, right? They've got this very sort of privileged view into your life already. But just because they live across the river, they live in the more modern, part of the city that has access, that has good roads, that has the big malls, that has, the new McDonald's and all of that.
That has the sympathies of the Hindus, as clear and direct as that, as the Hindu legislators of
Right,
Gujarat. Yeah.
right. Um, there is always, I think in that moment I realized as a child first, when that conversation on the phone happened with this person, that they saw me as this instrument, for friendship in school, in this school space, which is such a like forced secular, where you have to pretend and you have to behave and you have to hold a certain civility for the other, for people who you don't fully understand. But the minute our actual geographies were divided, and I live in the old Muslim ghetto side and she lives in the, cool, swanky Hindu side, there is an immediate window that goes down. And again, like, I think about the fact that they have these walls even in, the West Bank, and the fact that even in Ahmedabad, they built a full wall so that Donald Trump could not see the slums and the squalor and whatever. I wonder sometimes if there is a psychological wall in people that just comes down, instantly comes down the minute they have to actually use their conscience towards you. And for me, that wall is something that I'm always kind of, testing and knocking towards to see what makes that come down. Because this question of empathy we've been speaking about from the beginning, why is it that I am able to see you with more empathy? And yet in that moment, you're questioning my reality. When you call me up and say, oh, no, but everything is, been fine. And even today, I meet people from Ahmedabad who tell me, yeah, 3 days the violence lasted. Even today, they're in their 40s, 50s. There are people who write to me and say, we're so sorry, we just didn't realize this is what was happening.
How do you not realize?
For me, that is fascinating, because the truth is, when I moved to the South to live, just the amount of community like connectedness there was compared to Gujarat, I was like, this couldn't have happened in another city like Chennai, or one of these places, because people would immediately know that this is happening, a program of this scale, right? But something about how, when we say like Gujarat was a lab, that Ahmedabad was this testing ground of an ideology, this is what it means, that you have divided up people not just geographically, but ideologically, including the smallest of children. I think I still have that in the book. I don't remember half the things I've left and removed. But there was this little boy I wrote about who we used to go watch cricket matches in their house. And they were a Jain family. And he was like 6, 7 years old. And I must have been in seventh grade. And I went over to his house to watch a match with them. And I was wearing a mint color t-shirt. And he tells me, "ये पाकिस्तान का color क्यों पहना है?" And for me, the instant reaction was like one chata I want to give this little 6-year-old. Who gives you the right? And how, as a 6-year-old, are you being this? Because for me, it was forget you're questioning my loyalty and you're questioning my place as an Indian Muslim, not even all that. For me, it was like, you're so small, you're speaking to an older person like this. Like I'm like an older sibling to you. How can you talk to me like this? So it's those ways in which growing up in a place like Gujarat and in some of these like more contested areas, you start recognizing that people are being trained from a very, very early age to not see you as a full person. And they're already being shown ways to denigrate you. The children have been taught that this is how you talk to someone and call them out and you can tease them this way because they're seeing the elders do it.
This is pretty much the reality that we're living in right now, right? This walls between us. It's not just like the context of a city, like that pretty much is what it is there. But if you pick up anything that has happened after 2002, or even after like the demolition of Babri Masjid, or for decades, it's almost been like something is happening and the rest are just oblivious of it. I feel like as the years progress towards where we are right now, towards 2025, that has happened more and more, where people can just look
Yes.
away. That's the experience of Manipur, right? People just looked
Right.
away, or people were not informed. Even
Absolutely.
after they saw what they saw, people are choosing to look away because the government wants you to look away. And
We're
how
also
that, huh?
And we're also living in an age of maximum distraction, right, Grishma? Like there is so much, like our attention is the most valuable commodity right now. Every corporation in the world is spending millions and billions for our attention for 10 seconds on a reel, 15 seconds somewhere else, some, new silly thing come out in the theater, some new thing to go shop, some online shopping. So we're definitely living in a time when there is so much to easily distract us from the realities around us. And those realities have not changed, even though all of this commodity around us has changed. So that's the big dissonance that I constantly see in people, that there's lesser and lesser attention now for social realities. And there's lesser patience for social realities because it almost feels like an inconvenience that these things are happening. So it almost feels like we are inconveniencing people by telling them to listen to this story, right? Whereas it is a story that affects them, whether they like it or not. You could be sitting in Bangalore, but what is happening in Manipur is affecting you. You just don't recognize it right now because you've lost your ability to process connections. You've lost your ability to see, how the human network, works, how societies are built, how politics are built, that you can't see the connection that when Gujarat burns and then a decade later, those same figures are up for election. It's the lapse of attention that causes these other things to happen, right? You stopped paying attention after 2002 to Gujarat's Muslims. You stopped listening because you were like, okay, I gave them my, 5 minutes on watching on NDTV or wherever I watched the news. I know what happened and that's it. And then those wounds will fester and things will eventually get worse and more complicated. So and this was not how it was. I mean, I don't know about your age, but I grew up in the age of Doordarshan, and that being our only choice as news, where we would have to sit and watch Doordarshan, and there would be like one Pranoy Roy's show or whatever that we used to all watch. But as a family and as a middle class family, the amount of news we used to consume in that house. Today, I look at it and I'm like, that was insane. How much the news was constantly not only running in the background, but the newspaper was in. There were 2 or 3 different languages of newspapers. We were constantly wanting to know there was an intention to wanting to know what is happening in our street, in our state, internationally. That has completely shifted around. There's no interest other than if it, becomes like something you can virtue signal about. Black Lives Matter is happening in America means you put one black thing on your Instagram. So, like now suddenly with Palestine, they'll be talking in India. Liberal Hindus will be talking about Palestine, but they don't know what is happening in their own city to Muslims, and where Muslims are not being given jobs or houses or being denied, citizenship. You're not aware of those things. You're not aware of the very discrimination in front of your eyes, but this thing that feels like it's trending or that you can attach value and attention to is somehow more important. So it's like we're living in a very upside down time right now.
I think on one side there is definitely ignorance, but also there is, on the other side, there is this acceptance of, this is their reality. This is the reality of people who are from the lower caste. This is the reality of Muslims. And there's only
Yeah,
so much that I will think about it, or that's only
yeah,
so much that I will, do anything about it. Or I'll even honor it with my attention.
right,
Or, I feel like we are at that place as well, where people are more, can be more informed than before, no? Like at the time when there was just a news channel that you're getting news from, you didn't have news at the click of your fingers. But when you do have that, and you still have to be ignorant, what does that say of you? And, like collective response to social realities, right? That is what kind of is disillusioning for a lot of people, for journalists like me, for people who are elsewhere, isn't it? Like, how do you respond to that? How is it that you respond to the to this attitude of people deciding that this is not like something I want to deal with. I want to be numb to this, and that numbness will kind of humanize my ignorance. You know what I
right,
mean?
right. Yeah, it's actually very interesting. I was actually thinking about this just a few days ago. Um, and writing this book has made me actually reflect on this. But before 2002 even happened, we had been taught in high school about the Holocaust. And I remember becoming obsessed with wanting to know more. Because for my child mind, it was very unthinkable that humans could have gone to this length to annihilate people and gone through such creative, like technological means that they've created to annihilate a whole community, right? And for me, it was such a shock to my system that I had questions and I was very hungry for information of how could this have happened. And I think for me, the big question was, how could this have happened on a world stage and nobody did anything to intervene? What was everyone doing? And then cut to a year later, the pogrom happens in Gujarat. Now, since then, I have a traumatized mind already, but that has never stopped me from continuing to study and read about the Holocaust. If anything, I feel even more like I wanted to go and read about other genocides and other Holocausts because I'm trying to find meaning and find an equivalence, a sort of, something that explains this unimaginable thing that I was witness to. When my book has released in India last year, now I've been hearing a lot of people who have read it, passed it on to someone, somebody who's found it somewhere. And a few times now I've heard people say to me, I've been trying to get my friends to read it, but they all say, oh, this is too depressing, yeah, right now. And my usual follow-up question is about their identity, because now I am curious. Like, if you are not Muslim or you are not a Dalit or Adivasi or somebody who is at the receiving end of a lot of injustice in different ways, what is taken away so much of your time and attention and empathy that you are not able to give it to something that happens in your own country? What is it that you are so busy with, right? And this sense of like, oh, the world is so depressing right now, I just can't read one more thing about this. If you are not curious about why the world is depressing, how are we ever going to stop it from being depressing, right? So for me, it becomes like this weird loop that people are stuck in, where they just want everything to magically turn and become okay without looking at the construction of it. looking at the scaffolding and saying, what is this holding all of these oppressive systems up and this depressing and creating this depressing atmosphere? So for me, it's like, fine, don't read my book. Go read 5 other things that exist out there. But how are you not curious?
That's a great question, and I think that's a great note to end this conversation, because that is the core of not just reading this book, but responding to everything that's happening in India right now and elsewhere. So I think that's a good note to wrap up. But before I finish, I want to say that thank you, Zara, for joining us. And whenever it is that you come back to your home, which is Chennai, we'll be waiting to do discussions of this book. We'll be waiting to receive you. We'll be waiting to take you to the coast and everything that you want to do in Chennai. So we are waiting for that. I'm waiting for that. Whenever it is
I'm
that you
waiting
come
for
back,
that. Just you saying it is making me cry.
it is.
Yeah,
I mean, I like your book speaks about having, like, it speaks to me about having faith in something. What that something is, I don't know, but I have that faith that I will see you in Chennai, and we'll
inshallah.
do everything that you love about Chennai and I love
We will
about
go eat
Chennai.
sundal. We will go eat sundal at on
100%.
Metabi. Yes.
100%, 100%. We'll eat sundal, we'll eat mean curry, we'll do everything that you like. And
Mirchi bhaji.
yeah, done. I think that's a great note to end this interview on. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank
And
you,
I
Greeshma. It was lovely. Just so nice to have it feels like just a heart to heart with a friend. So thank you.
thank you. Thank you.